not protected by the First Amendment. The one I didn't put up here is fighting words. That's kind of an old time concern. Back before we really knew how people worked in psychology, the brain worked, they thought you could say something that was so insightful and so awful that it would immediately cause people to like put up their dukes and start fighting, right? We know that's not really how things work these days. So the category of fighting words hasn't been used in decades, but I always like to talk about it because it's a little fun. Now, there are some other foundations of intellectual freedom that I think are worth noting. One comes from John Stuart Mill, who wrote On Liberty. And he said we can only restrict liberty to prevent harm to other people. So you should have the right to do whatever you want to do, including freedom of speech, up to the point where it harms somebody else. That's where the limit should be. So again, very, very broad. Justice Holmes, in a famous dissent in 1919, started talking about the marketplace of ideas. And this was really the first time this phrase came up, this idea was used. And his argument was that we should have access to a broad range of ideas and let them compete in sort of an intellectual marketplace. And over time, the best ideas will become more dominant and people will sort of veer towards the truth over time. This gets a little complicated these days with social media and misinformation. I'm a little wary of the marketplace of ideas right now, but it is one of the foundations for how we think about intellectual freedom. So let's go back to the definition of intellectual freedom for a few minutes. It's the right of every individual to seek and receive information from all points of view. What does that mean? All points of view. That is really broad, right? Does that mean we have books about climate change and the man-made causes accelerating the destruction of the earth? Do we have books that argue climate change is a hoax and it's no big deal, it's not going on? Do we have books that counter those books? Like, all points of view can get pretty broad, right? When I'm teaching about this, I talk to my students and I say, it doesn't just mean 3 books that are Democratic and 3 books that are Republican and you're done. What about books from a socialist perspective, a green perspective, a libertarian perspective, the full spectrum of ideas and topics? That's what a good library should contain. That can get tough, right? And that leads us to book censorship. So these numbers come from the American Library Association. Ideally, libraries, when they face a challenge, they report it up the chain to the Office of Intellectual Freedom, which collects data about challenges. And then every year they produce a report about challenges nationwide. You can see from 2020 to 2021, it jumped significantly. And then it has kept rising ever since then. From 2022 to 2023, 65% increase year over year. And it's important to note that these are just a fraction of the challenges that occur. The Office of Intellectual Freedom estimates that 80% or so of challenges don't actually get reported to them. So this number, 4,200 books challenged or banned, is only 20% of what's going on out there. In other words, it's a big problem right now, especially in public and school libraries. And I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I've heard that the numbers so far in 2024 look a little better. There's not such a drastic increase, but we'll see how the rest of the year pans out. The national presidential election may have an impact, frankly. But we also see challenges to library programming, different resources libraries have, displays, making a display for Pride Month or making a display of romance novels, audiovisual content, even databases. Some libraries have canceled their subscription to EBSCO databases because of challenges. And it goes beyond that too. Some librarians have lost their jobs or been forced out, and some libraries have closed. So far temporarily, but libraries in Michigan, Iowa, and Wyoming have closed over book censorship. So you guys probably know this, but these challenges are a problem because the role of libraries is to provide access to almost all information. There are physical constraints on what a library can hold, and some resources are not relevant or appropriate for some libraries. That's why I said almost all information. But generally, a broad range of information should be available to all people in the community, including viewpoints that aren't popular. Book bans, of course, try to restrict access. It's usually based on the content of the books. It's often focused on children's and teen books. And I want to say it's really antithetical to libraries. It's the opposite of what libraries should be doing. Okay. So the next question, of course, is why is this happening? Why are library resources being banned? And it really comes down to two words: difficult content. This book has difficult content. This book is difficult. I don't want my child reading it. What does that mean? What it really means is that it contains content that falls into one of these three buckets. It has content that's about the LGBTQIA community. It has content that I'm calling DEI. It might talk about structural racism. It might just have protagonists and themes that highlight Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And then the third category is sexually explicit. This includes sex scenes, sex education books, also books that just have a scene of rape or incest get put into that category as well. Nearly all books that have been challenged in the past 3 years fall into at least one of these categories. And to demonstrate, these are the most challenged books from 2023. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this. I know it's really fine print. And I'll just say, usually the ALA says these are the top 10 most challenged books. There were some ties, so there's 13 books here. But every one of these books was challenged for one of the three reasons I just said. So this is a really serious problem. And I think it comes down to representation, right? It's about seeing ourselves and seeing other people in books. You may be familiar with the work done by Dr. Bishop. She talks about mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Some books can be windows and let you see into another world, that you see something that you don't personally know about. Some books are sliding glass doors and you can really enter into that world. Anybody who's read Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter for a few hours, and then you put the book down and you're like, wait a minute, I'm sitting on my couch in the 2000s. Like, right? You kind of get into that world for a little while. And then some books are mirrors and let us see ourselves reflected. And we can see ourselves in different places, in different communities that we might need to see and experience. There's a bigger picture at stake here besides a book here and a book there. These are movements to restrict access to materials that challenge a traditional worldview. And I do say right-wing movements because almost all of the book bans currently are coming from the right. Sometimes left-wing movements want to ban books. That is a small minority of what's going on right now. I think it's a response to the increasing social acceptance of the queer community and the role of people of color in our world. We're having frank conversations about things like generational poverty, structural racism, homophobia. And those conversations make some people really uncomfortable. And then there's also a lot of changing demographics in the country right now. In the next 15 years, we'll become a majority minority country. For those under the age of 18, I think is a statistic. But people are afraid of those changes and the implications of those changes. If things change so drastically in my community, in my society, what does that mean for me, right? There's also a broader push to defund the public sector in our country right now. We see this with municipal parks and state parks. They're losing money. Municipal pools. When I was a kid, every town had a pool. Now you hardly ever see them because it's a public good. And public schools. We've all heard about pushes to defund public schools, switch them to the funding to charter schools and so on. Really what this comes down to is libraries are for everyone. They want to be for everyone. And some people don't like that. So what do we do about these challenges? I think the first thing is to remember that a mindset of intellectual freedom equals serving one's community. It promotes serving your diverse community. And every community out there is diverse in various ways. You may live in a fairly homogenous town that's mostly of one race, mostly of one religion, but not everybody's of the same religion. Not everybody's in the same socioeconomic demographic, different levels of education, different hobbies, different work backgrounds. So there's variance in every community. And intellectual freedom is a way to serve that variance. It also creates space for marginalized groups to exist and to feel welcome. And it expands the perspectives available to dominant groups. So I have here a handy 7-step guidelines for defending intellectual freedom. We'll go through this a little bit, and then we can talk about it more in Q&A if you guys want. Before a challenge, it's a really good idea to create and implement formal policies. You want a collection development policy, a reconsideration policy. You might think that most libraries have these, but a lot of smaller libraries don't have policies currently. It's great to have a policy to fall back on that gives you like support and lends credence to your arguments in favor of intellectual freedom. You also want to educate your board of trustees or the school board. We'll get into how to do that and what to tell them a little bit later on. But having a supportive library board is really important. They can be representatives in your community that advocate for the library. And I think it's important to share the library's core values with the community. Things like intellectual freedom, privacy, the social good. Like these are things that the library stands for, and we should be proud of them. Let's share them with the community. And we want to engage with the community, make sure we're going out in the community, interacting, doing outreach, so that people have a positive impression of the library as a foundation. And then we also need to ensure the library has a wide diversity of resources. It can be difficult to collect that diversity of resources. There are still very few books published with people of color as the main protagonists, for example, especially in children's and young adult stories. So you have to seek those out and make sure your library is really serving the community. So if a challenge occurs, the first thing to do is to remain calm and engaged, stay professional. And this is really hard, but you want to listen in a non-defensive manner. You don't want to get angry, cross your arms, make one of those faces. A lot of times people just want to tell you how they feel and express their frustration. Sometimes you can redirect with a reference interview. I'm sorry this book isn't right for your child. Were they looking for something about dragons? Let's go find another book. Sometimes that is really successful. If it's not, or if the person involved still seems frustrated, you can offer the paperwork for a formal challenge. What does that mean? Move my slides around. We'll get to what that means. You want to report a formal challenge. So contact the Office for Intellectual Freedom and let them know about the challenge. It's anonymous reporting. They like to collect data about your library, but you can just tell them you have a challenge and leave it at that. It's also helpful to contact your state or local library administration associations. The local state library association can have resources that are really relevant to your community, your state. And make sure the library administration, the board are all informed and kind of on the same page. It's also important to find support. Going through a challenge can be really tough. So I encourage library workers to contact friends or supporters of the library, get help from library organizations. Consider reaching out to local media. This one can be a little tricky, but a lot of local media, a lot of media in general is big fans of the First Amendment and the freedom of speech. So if you can frame your response to the challenge in terms of the First Amendment, that might help you garner more support. And just sharing that the library is going through a difficult time and could use some support from the community, that can go a long ways too. So then we move into preparing your response. You want to follow your formal process, which should involve things like forming a committee to review the resource, consider relevant reviews to the reviews of the material. You find those in library journals, online, that sort of thing. And then you send your response to the challenger. And I think it's important, again, to refer to the library core values of intellectual freedom, public good. And that way it doesn't just sound like, well, I didn't like your challenge, so I'm not going to do it. You want to give some structure and some foundation, some heft to your response, right? So let's talk about formal paperwork and a request for reconsideration form. So basically a formal process to consider a challenge to library materials. You're reconsidering the appropriateness of the materials in question. Generally, the patron completes a form, the committee reviews the item and makes a recommendation. Sometimes the patron could appeal to a library board. That appeal process often makes them feel like you're really being heard, it's really being taken seriously. But this again means it's important to have an educated and supportive library board. The American Library Association has a lot of resources if you don't have this sort of policy or if you need to update it. And you can Google ALA request for reconsideration or that sort of thing. You don't have to copy down this link. So when you're handling a challenge, it's also important to communicate with your community. I recommend avoiding social media arguments. We all think we can win social media arguments, but the truth is most of the time nobody wins, right? It's really hard to convince someone and change someone's mind via social media. And sometimes what ends up happening is people pile on and things get worse and worse and get out of hand. So even though it's really hard to avoid getting into things in social media, that's what my recommendation. I think it's also important to communicate with your community about the challenge and about the outcome. Somebody didn't like this book, we considered it really seriously, we reviewed the book, and this is what we decided. That helps keep your community informed, lets them know that you take concerns from the community really seriously. Throughout all this, you want to stay neutral, professional, calm. You can vent to somebody at home, coworker, but you want to stay calm and professional when interacting with your community. And then you need to take time to recharge your batteries. Going through a challenge is really tough, emotionally draining. Not just for the library director and administrators, but library workers too. They might face people coming up to the desk and saying things, for example. So you want to recharge your batteries, reflect on what worked or what didn't work, what you need to tweak in your process. Keep building those relationships in the community. It's handy if you let the Office of Intellectual Freedom know about the outcome. That helps when they're tracking. So let's talk about the rise in book censorship, book challenges. It really comes down to new groups, right? There are new people challenging library resources. And the way we think about a challenge needs to change. So pre-2020, if somebody had a concern about a book, they might come up to the desk, say, I don't like this book, I don't want my child reading it, have a conversation with the librarian, maybe fill out the paperwork, maybe not. That's how those conversations went. But now there's new tactics at play. These folks will go to board meetings or city council meetings. They'll use social media, all before talking to the librarian or instead of talking to the librarian. They take passages from books out of context. So they might take, one panel from a graphic novel and be really angry about that one panel. They are misusing terminology and legal phrases. They'll say this book is obscene. There's a legal definition of obscenity, and whatever book they're holding up doesn't meet it, I can promise you that. Public libraries don't have money to spend on obscene materials. I think arguing about the semantics of like obscenity and child pornography is probably not worth it. But you can rest assured, like in your own mind, that's not really what obscenity means, right? These folks will use props and posters. And there's a lot of yelling and accusations thrown at librarians, and some of it's really unpleasant. So to dive more into this, I want to talk about the difference between grassroots and astroturfing. Grassroots political activity is organic, it's from the ground up. It's me being upset about something, talking to my fellow citizen, talking to somebody else, and we get together and form a movement and contact our politicians. And like I said, it's from the bottom up, it's independent of political elites. Astroturfing is different. If you think about like football fields, most of the time these days, they're not playing on real grass, they're playing on fake grass or astroturf. And that's where this comes from. It's fake grassroots. It's political elites organizing campaigns against certain books and certain categories of books. So it has the illusion of organic populist support, but it's not coming from the bottom up, it's coming from the top down. And you can see this in groups like Moms for Liberty. Almost every state has a chapter of Moms for Liberty, the Indiana Moms for Liberty, for example. Sounds like it's state specific, they're focused on their state. There's a national organization behind it. And it's run by a couple people out of Florida who have political ties. So that's a great example of an astroturfing movement. So what are the implications once we understand this? I think it's even more important to avoid social media arguments, because you're not just arguing with one person in your community, there's a whole network and organization behind it. It's also important to avoid semantics arguments. These folks have made up their mind about what they think is obscene. Arguing with them about the legal definition is not going to be helpful. But it's also really important to rally library supporters. I don't think the librarians should be commenting on social media, but people in the community who are fans of the library can jump in. Then it's not tarnishing the library's reputation, but it looks like community members are rallying to the library's cause. That's positive. It's also important to demonstrate the diversity of community that you're in and the need to serve everyone in the community. I've been talking with the library director in Kentucky, and when people get upset in her library, she says, look, queer people pay taxes too. They deserve to have books that represent them. There's plenty of books that represent straight white folks. Let's have some books that represent other people who pay taxes. It's often a convincing argument. And I think it's really important to emphasize parental choice. Each parent should be able to guide their own child, which means the complainer should be able to guide their child to what they want, but somebody who's not upset about that book should also be able to guide their own child. So let's talk about children for a minute. Legally, minors' rights are slightly more limited than adults. In the US, we have this sort of subconscious narrative that children don't have rights, that they're just subjects. But at least with freedom of speech, that's not really true. They have almost all the same freedom of speech rights as adults do. It's really broad. But then there's concern about harming children, right? We don't want to harm our kids. We want to protect them. The truth is, though, most kids don't live idealized lives. I can almost guarantee in every community there are kids impacted by divorce, substance abuse and misuse, physical and emotional abuse, economic hard times, fighting within the household, right? We're not living idealized lives. And if a kid can find solace in a book that talks about substance abuse or that talks about mental health, I say good for that kid, right? The world beyond the library is not sanitized. It's not a perfect, clean, beautiful world. It's messy and complicated. That's what our books show. And I think it's can be really reassuring and comforting to see that reflected in the books that we're reading. It's also worth remembering that when we talk about minors, there's a huge range of maturity levels, right? I can understand that a seven-year-old and a 17-year-old should probably be reading different material. But if we try to pass laws and rules about minors, then we're lumping them all into the same category, and that's not fair to the older minors. So another implication of these astroturfing movements and the rise in book bans is that we need to update our policies. So here are some suggestions for updating those reconsideration forms and collection development policies. Only review a book once every 3 years, once every 5 years. Sometimes people orchestrate their book challenges, and person A might challenge this book, it gets retained in the library. Then person B challenges the book, you have to go through the whole thing again, follow your policy. Then person C challenges the book. And this has the effect of keeping the book controversial and not circulating the book. So if you only review a book once every 3 years or 4 years, then you short circuit that technique, right? I also think it's really important to put something in your policy that the challenger has to be a local stakeholder. I talked to a librarian in South Carolina who received 85 challenges in one day from somebody in Arizona. And they didn't have anything in their policy to say those were out of bounds. They came through as legitimate looking challenges, so they went through all 85 requests. But if you say you have to be a library card holder, you have to live in our community, those seem pretty reasonable boundaries, right? And if it's a school library, I think the challengers should be parents or guardians of kids in that school. We saw this a lot in Missouri in the past few years. People who didn't live in the school district would challenge books in that school. People who didn't have students in that school would challenge books. And again, I think you need to have a stake in the conversation, right? I think that's what's important. I think it's smart and strategic to only take a certain number of challenges per person. Again, that librarian in South Carolina had 85 challenges to deal with at once. What if you said you can challenge 3 books at a time? That seems reasonable. If they have a real concern, they can challenge 3 books, get through those, challenge 3 more if they want. But that makes it manageable for libraries, right? I think on the form, you want to make sure that the challenger has read the entire material and has considered the controversial part in context. They also should really articulate their concern in detail. There was a family, man and woman in Texas who did over 200 challenges to a public library, and each reason for complaint was the same. This book contains sexual content or derogatory content or communist content. Like they had 4 or 5 claims in their little paragraph, and they just copied and pasted it over and over to every challenge form. So it wasn't specific and relevant necessarily to that book. But again, the library didn't have any policy relevant to that, so they had to review all 200 plus challenges. And I think we should only consider formal written challenges. If somebody's complaining on social media, if somebody comes into the library upset, don't worry about it. Let it go. People have a right to voice their opinion. Only consider it if they're willing to go the extra step of something formal. So I mentioned library boards a few minutes ago. Let's circle back to them. When I say board, I mean a school board, a city council, or board of trustees, depending upon what's relevant for your library. And these library boards can play a role in the reconsideration process. They approve policies and guidelines, and they can really be public advocates for the library. They can also arbitrarily change policies or remove books. They can vote to fire the library director. And a lot of times they're scared of public opinion, scared of controversy. So this means we really need supportive library boards. Through things like strategic forethought, ongoing training and support, we can make sure that our library boards are supportive of the library and of intellectual freedom. I think it's important to review library policies with the board on a regular basis and to have some frank conversations. Look, we might have books you disagree with. We might have books you don't like, but they serve other people in our community, and that's why we have them. You don't have to like every book in the library, right? Having those frank conversations with people ahead of time can be really useful. Okay, let's talk about staff training. I think it's helpful to look at actual challenges that have come in. If your library hasn't had one yet, probably the next county over has. And that director, those administrators will probably be happy to share it informally, right? You should review the library's holdings. Is there soft censorship going on? Are you avoiding certain topics, certain books out of fear? We need to look at that and be aware of those possible tendencies. I think it's always important for library workers to get their administrator or director involved when there's challenges going on or somebody comes in angry. It's also important to stay informed about local movements, local news that's going on. Some librarians first became aware of movements against their library by going to the county fair and seeing a booth where people were arguing that the library should be shut down. So that's what I mean. We need to stay informed about what's going on locally to be prepared. And then I think it's also really helpful to role play. Fighting a challenge is really tough. So maybe one person can pretend to be a challenger and somebody else can be a library worker trying to respond to that challenge. We need to practice how to respond, practice staying calm and professional, so those things come more easily to us in the moment. All right, I'm going to wrap up in just a few minutes. Here are some concrete ways to support libraries. I'm happy to get into these in more detail. I think the most important of those ways is to get involved locally. There are a lot of ways that folks in your community can get involved. Of course, the most important one is voting in local and state elections. And we need to look for leaders and politicians who will be supportive of libraries, who understand the need to serve a diverse community. And then we need to rally and support those politicians. Ultimately, it's about using your voice on behalf of the library and encouraging your community to do so as well. Defending intellectual freedom is really equivalent to defending the freedom of speech. And when we do that, we're standing up for the core values of America. Freedom of speech is a bedrock value for the US. So defending intellectual freedom is really serving our country and our foundations. Sometimes it means being brave. People in your community might be upset. They might be confused. They might have heard lies or misdirection about what the library does. So sometimes it takes courage to be a librarian. But there's a lot of joy in being a library worker as well. Serving your community, finding just the right resource for somebody in need, right? So I'll end there. Little shameless plug. These are the two books I've written, and you can get a discount on either one. Both of them have some chapters about preparing for challenges, and role playing and that sort of thing. I really enjoyed speaking with you guys, and I'm happy to take questions and discussion. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, so the question was about self-censorship and how much we're seeing it, different examples of soft censorship. I think it's happening a lot. I think a lot of library workers are pretty scared of these new groups, pretty scared of their tactics. Um, like I said, it's stressful and draining to be involved in these challenges. And so I can understand it, but I don't think it's the right thing to do strategically or in serving one's community. Um, Soft censorship can involve relocating books um, from the juvenile section to the teen section, or from the teen section, the young adult section, into the adult section. If you think about it, what 5-year-old kid is going to go to the teen section to look for a book? They're not, right? So even though the book is available, it's out there in the shelves, it's not in the place where it's accessible to the relevant audience. This reminds me of one of my favorite stories of soft censorship. Now, it occurred 20 years ago when I was just starting out on my library science degree. Um, there was a library here in Indiana, I'll keep it anonymous, that bought The Joy of Gay Sex. And they're pretty proud of themselves for having such a controversial book and feeling pretty good about serving their community. And then they put it on a book truck and put it in the basement. And if you wanted it, you had to go up to the librarian and tell them that you wanted that book. And then the librarian would make a little show of going down to the basement and getting the book, rescuing the book, and bringing it back up. Guess what? The book didn't circulate. So then they removed it from, they weeded it pretty quickly. That's definitely a form of censorship, right? Having to go ask for access, especially for certain sensitive topics, can really restrict that access. A lot of school librarians will put difficult books in their desk or on a shelf behind them. That's the same sort of thing, honestly. If it's a book about like mental health and or substance use, and a kid has to come up and ask you to check out that book, that's creating a barrier to access. Be brave, put that book on the shelves. Most people are going to go right by that book and not see it. But the kid who needs to see it will then be able to. The other thing I'll say about soft censorship is we don't have a good way of tracking it. And so it can go under the radar. It can be pretty subtle. So I think as library workers, we really have to sort of check ourselves and check our colleagues. Like, hey, the last shipment that came in, I noticed there were no authors of color in the young adult books you ordered. Are you double checking that you're ordering diverse books? comfortable to call out our colleagues, but we need to keep each other accountable and keep ourselves accountable too. Yeah. Okay.
Where was where was the booth fair?
Mm-hmm.
Closing the library. Can you share a little bit?
Yeah. So the question was about the fair booth that argued for closing the library. This happened in Wyoming. And there was, I can't remember the name of the group. It wasn't Moms for Liberty, but it was a group similar to them. And they had a booth at the fair that was arguing basically we shouldn't fund public schools. We need to look at what the library is holding. We need to hold our local city council accountable and hold their feet to the fire. And it got a lot of traffic. And the librarian happened to see that and was like, oh no, what's going to happen? Waiting for the other shoe to fall. And then a lot did happen. A lot of challenges came through. A lot of angry meetings at public library trustee meetings. And the librarian and the library workers were able to stay strong and weather the storm, but at least they had a little advance notice that something might be coming down the road, right? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. How can we tell the difference between a grassroots movement and astroturfing sort of movement? I think one of the key things is grassroots movements are usually, what's the right word? Belligerent or angry. They're often are coming, expressing like concern, confusion, wanting to work within the community to make the community better. And I think astroturfing groups don't necessarily come with that at the forefront. It's almost like their concern is more creating controversy than necessarily improving the community. And I think they're a lot more likely to have like the same sorts of signs at different rallies. And, you know, if somebody says, I'm a member of XYZ group, you can go and Google XYZ group. And if you see 30 chapters across the country, that is a little suspicious because it costs money to organize like that, right? It takes time and resources to organize to that extent. So then you start to wonder, is that really grassroots or is there some funding behind it? Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure, sure. So how helpful is it to demonstrate the inverse, right? When dealing with a challenge. Mm-hmm. Right. I think demonstrating that inverse, like the books you like may be removed from the shelves too if we start removing all the books. I think that can be valuable. Sometimes when I talk to Kentucky public librarians, I do frequent training for them, and I have a slide that shows an empty bookshelf, right? If we take down all the books that are considered controversial or that somebody could be concerned or upset with, we're going to be left with very few books. There's a meme going around Facebook where people are angry that Charlotte's Web was challenged in the past, right? Every book could be controversial practically. And so I think sometimes that really can be effective. Like, well, you like books about XYZ, but other people don't want those in the public library. Should we take all of those out? I think the angrier someone is, the less effective that is, because they're not open to seeing the reasoning behind that, right? But I think it's definitely a strategy to use. Yeah. Anything else online? Okay. Well, it's about the top of the hour. I want to thank you guys all for coming and listening. And please jot down my email address. You can also Google me. I'm really easy to find. I love talking about this stuff. I love helping librarians. So feel free to follow up with any questions or discussion. Thank you very much.